Welcome everyone to this session called Improving Research Practice, Lessons Learned from 3 Methods Training Institutes. I'm Terry Pickett from Georgia State University, and I have 3 colleagues here. Brooks Bowden from University of Pennsylvania, Ann O'Connell from Ohio State University, and Josh Palanin from the American Institutes for Research. And so how this session is going to go is that we're going to actually talk about the 3 training institutes that one of the people on this call at least is involved with. We're going to start with just an introduction of each of these training methods training institutes. And then we want this session to be interactive. So I have a couple of questions prepared that I'm going to ask each of the members of the panel. And then we're going to have some time for questions and to from the audience and to have a conversation. So so let me just start by asking each of the participants involved here, or each of the panel members involved here who are involved in one of these training grants, to talk a little bit about the training grant, so we get a little introduction to that, and just who their audience is, what the purpose of the training grant is, and anything else I want to share. And I'm actually going to stop sharing these slides right now, but I'll put the links to these training grants in the chat. So maybe we'll start with Ann and eBite.
Great. Thank you, Terry, and welcome. Hi, everyone. I'm Ann O'Connell from Ohio State, and we're in the 2nd year of our 3-year training grant called Evidence-Based Intervention Training for Education, or eBite for short. My colleagues on this project are Natasha Bowen from the College of Social Work and Tracy Stuckey from our Center for Technology and Innovation at OSU, and we have 2 colleagues from the Voinovich School of Public Affairs at Ohio University, Marcia Lewis and Ani Ruhil. And for our training, we work with teams and individuals from schools and districts, along with their higher education or other partners, to strengthen capacity to use evidence-based interventions as defined by ESSA. And our targeted audience are teachers, school counselors, special education coordinators, school social workers, principals, and higher education faculty. So education professionals that are seeking to learn more about using evidence-based interventions. And our training has 2 components. First, we have formal training through a week-long workshop, and then we have follow-up academic year coaching. And our curriculum for the summer workshop follows the cycle of continuous improvement targeted towards selection and use of evidence-based interventions. Our workshop topics and activities include needs assessment and data use skills, definitions of evidence and the ESSA and What Works Clearinghouse tiers of evidence, how to use the What Works Clearinghouse in their materials, along with many other clearinghouses and websites that curate EBIs, how to write SMART goals and build logic models, matching interventions to local context and assessing how well an intervention might work for one's own specific school or context. We also talk about fidelity and implementation and the importance of progress monitoring and measures and tools for evaluation. We also have a group of consultants that we invited to our summer workshop as invited speakers to draw on their expertise with the What Works Clearinghouse, with their partnerships that they've established with principals, districts, and schools. And we also included experts on early childhood, youth development, and interventions for minority or marginalized students, as well as on experts on developing or replicating large-scale evidence-based interventions. And the second component of our training is coaching, which I think makes our program really unique. Our coaching activities are very hands-on and span the academic year after the workshop. So right now, we're in the middle of our first coaching cohort. And during coaching, each of the teams or individuals, partners, identify their unique goals, what they'd like to achieve for the academic year, which ranges anywhere along the training continuum I described earlier. We currently have 9 active teams, and we've been meeting every 3 to 4 weeks and sometimes more depending on their needs. We're currently recruiting for our second cohort with a national focus. In our first cohort, we focused on districts and schools in Ohio. So we're seeking a national collection of teams for our second cohort. We had 42 participants in 14 teams, and some of those are individuals in special roles like regional data leads or state support team members who would be responsible for working with educators in a larger region. Our first workshop was virtual, and we're planning for an in-person workshop with a hybrid backup if we need for cohort 2, which will be in June. Our coaching is all virtual, which was aligned with our original plan. We think that Columbus, Ohio is a good central US location for our training, and we are excited about being in person. I do think it will be a richer experience for our participants and also help with our goal to build networks among our participants. So that's a brief summary of what our program is designed to achieve. And I hope you can look at our website to learn a little bit more. Thanks, Terry.
About we hear from Brooks.
Hi. Thanks, Terry. So I am the director of the IES Methods Training and Economic Evaluation. And what that means is that we primarily focus on cost effectiveness, but we also, for some cohorts, cover cost benefit analysis as well. So my partners in this work are, they include Hank Levin at Teachers College, Clive Belfield at Queens College, Rob Shand at American University, and Viviana Rodriguez, who is completing a postdoc at Wisconsin and soon to be at UT San Antonio. So our training serves 2 cohorts or has 2 audiences. So annually we have 2 groups where we have one group which is more of the classic IES methods training audience of PhD level researchers who I sort of see as either being a PI or they might be the person who would be responsible for estimating cost or cost effectiveness within an efficacy or effectiveness trial or other types of IES funded work. The second group that we serve, they are in or working with government or institutions. So that might be a higher education institution. So we've had some people come from CUNY, but it could also be people from a state or a district who are working as analysts in those contexts. For those individuals, a PhD is not required. So generally, right, our program is designed for these 2 groups, and it intends to develop the skills necessary for them to integrate the concepts of cost effectiveness and economic evaluation into their research. So the goal is really to improve the quality of evidence that's produced in education to inform policy and the allocation of chronically scarce resources. And we also really would love to see more and more research in education meet high standards of quality, such as the SEER principles and, as Anne was mentioning, WWC standards and things like that. So we're hoping to support those efforts as well. We also are opening applications on February 1st, so that'll be coming soon. We'll have 2 in-person trainings this summer. One will be for the government and institutional analysts. That will be July 6th to 8th. So their training will have 30 trainees. It's 3 days, so it's shorter to allow the in-person meeting to be a little bit more focused and a little tighter, so it's more feasible for their schedules. And in that group, we also, we encourage groups to apply. So it might be up to 4 people who come and work together to bring, to increase really capacity within some of these agencies and institutions to do this kind of work. Our researcher cohort will be July 11th to the 15th, and that'll be 1 week here in Philadelphia this year. at the University of Pennsylvania. And that cohort is it's a little bit of a longer training because we include some instruction and practice on benefit cost analysis. For both of our cohorts, we follow up with participants pretty regularly over the course of about 12 months and then after annually. And we offer support following our time in person. And that tends to be, some of it is us reaching out to them, but a lot of it is just saying like our doors are open for you to reach out to us.
Great, thanks, Brooks. Josh?
Yeah, thanks, Terry. My name is Josh Blannon. I'm a principal researcher at American Institutes for Research, and we're in a unique spot for this session because I'm a co-PI on the Meta-Analysis Training Institute, and the PI is Terry. So Terry, I'll talk a little bit and then you can fill in. We are technically in the third year of our grant, but we are in the midst of the second no-cost extension. So the end of the current grant will be the end of this summer. So we've had two cohorts of participants, both in the previous 2 summers prior to the COVID pandemic. Our audience is primarily researchers and applied researchers from universities or research institutes like AIR. We're primarily targeting folks who have experience conducting meta-analyses or systematic reviews. So individuals who maybe have gone through the process once and are really interested in diving in and learning more about some of the advanced techniques for identifying large scale or potentially funded systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So these individuals tend to be university researchers or researchers who are a little bit further along in their careers, although we have had a few advanced graduate students as well. So the training lasts for 7 days. We start on a Sunday and we end on, or I guess it's 6 days. We start on a Sunday and we end on a Saturday. We have a mix of materials. We try to have some lecture included along with some hands-on experiences, as well as a presentation at the end that is meant to sort of set up individuals to write a meta-analysis proposal. And our goal with the entire training is to promote the use of meta-analysis through funding mechanisms, presumably through an IES exploration grant, but there's also other funding avenues out there as well. So we've had, like I mentioned, 2 cohorts of about 30 individuals over the last couple of years. I think Brooks mentioned this, so I'll put in a plug as well. I believe our application process is still open, and Terry, you probably already put in the chat the link. So if you're interested in this, check that out. And I think that's it. Terry, what did I miss?
I think you got it.
Oh, you know what? I should have.
Oh,
we should mention the other. We should mention 3 more co-PIs because I didn't do that.
Yes.
That's the last thing. Ryan Williams at AIR is another co-PI. Beth Tipton at Northwestern University, and Natasha Bretvas at University of Texas at Austin.
That's
so
right.
The 5 of us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. So, I mean, as you all heard, and please feel free to, have your camera on, ask questions or interrupt us while we're talking. As I said, those of you who came later, I'm just going to ask a couple questions of the panelists, but this is meant to be an interactive session. So if you have a question, please, feel free to jump in. But as you could see, these are 3 training grants with very different audiences and sort of formats and aims, but all in general, directed toward improving the kinds of evidence that we have out there for educational practice and policy. So the first question I wanted to pose to our panelists was, around this issue of, what has been, or can you describe a strategy that has been effective in your training grant to increase the research knowledge and or skills of your audience? So any one of our panelists can jump in.
I'm happy to go first. We have a textbook that we follow in our program. And so we send the textbook in advance, and it gives them an opportunity to review some of the materials and become a little bit more familiar with what we're going to be covering before they get there. We've been doing this for a while. And so I think, between the IES training program and then some of the offerings I've done through SHRI, I think I've worked with like maybe 300 different people. And so over all of those people, what I've really heard over and over and over again is that having exercises is just so meaningful. It just really helps them to take these concepts and ideas and apply them into practice. And so as we've done this training more and more over time, and with these 2 different cohorts, we've tried to build in more time for exercises and active learning and discussion as much as possible.
I'll go next. I would say at least one of the activities that we've done that has really helped with learning is the coaching aspect, because it's really embedded in the context of the teams that we're working with. So all the knowledge and skills they're learning about and reading about and practicing are really relevant to their work right in the moment. So there's relevant context to the learning. We also had a textbook that we provided to all participants, and we sent our materials in advance. So they had all of the our curriculum is pretty extensive, and we have a lot of tools that we've drawn from the expertise of others working in this area that we provided to all of our participants. We did try to make our activities as interactive as possible. I think that's a learning component for us about how to do that better online. So we did struggle with our initial say group-based activities. We wanted to allow for more networking, so to have people working in some different groups, that was kind of challenging for us to do. But so I think that having in person will make it a little bit easier to have the more engagement in some of our group-based activities. But overall, I think it was a good idea to send materials in advance. A lot of our coaching activities, or through those activities, we've learned that people have used our materials in developing professional development workshops for their teachers, at the school. I think there's been a lot of replication on the materials, and even some of the activities that we had participants engage in, they've used those in their own settings. So I think through the coaching, we've really been able to help our participants move farther than what was just covered in the summer workshop.
That's great, Ann. I'll just add one more thing. I mentioned this briefly in the introduction, but I mentioned that we have participants give a presentation at the end of the training, and what that involves is we assign people to groups at the start of the week, and then at the end of each day, those groups get together and discuss what we had talked about the previous, during the day, and also try to implement some of those strategies or topics actively. So if we're talking about database searching or screening, we try to do some activity that's involved with the group. And then along the way, the groups will develop a presentation each day, and so sort of builds into to the group presentation on the last day. This follows a similar strategy to, if anybody's familiar with the cluster randomized trial training that Mark Lipsy and Larry Hedges initially created. It was their model way back when, and Larry has continued on at Northwestern. They do a very similar style of activities, and so we followed in that tradition. And I personally enjoy talking to all the groups and engaging with all of them. And each of the presentations, the participants seem to get something different out of it. So it's a good activity.
Great. So actually, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, so I want to be responsive to those. So let me take the most recent one that came in first, which was about tools. And I don't know, Anjali, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks so much. Thanks for this panel. This is great. It's wonderful to hear about, all of your experiences and the ways that you approach a lot of these issues and questions. And so I guess, when there's like a new tool or method that you're developing or that you're trying to, introduce, how do you introduce it when there are other existing methods to which it's complementary? So you can imagine, often we talk about this in terms of like, a lot of qualitative methods and quantitative methods that you need both to be able to answer a question, thoughtfully and comprehensively. And so, how is it that you then introduce a new tool vis-a-vis these existing methods such that it is clear that, it's true that some may measure some things with more precision, and these other tools that you're introducing measure different things with, greater precision. And so how is it that you put them both out there in a thoughtful way such that, people understand that it's not either or, it's that we need both?
Well, I'll take a shot at that. That's a good question. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for the question. So I think I heard two kind of complementary questions, actually. There's the question about what happens when you have two methods or tools that are complementary to each other. How do you handle that? And then also the question that maybe you sparked to me, maybe you asked directly, I don't know, is what happens if there are two tools where one might replace the other one? Because both of those situations, I think, could probably come up. Well, I'll say, I don't know if this is a philosophy we've ever written down, but maybe it's one that I adhere to in these workshops. And that is, so I think there are definitely some best practices that we promote and that all the five of us, the PIs, are all on the same page about, and we would never waver from those. But I think we're all really open to what's next and describing what's on the cutting edge, while also saying this just came out in the last couple of years. And because our target audience is a group of researchers who are there to learn beyond what is sort of considered the basics, I think most of our participants are open to hearing about tools that could be complementary or replace other ones, as long as it's presented as this is a tool or an application that has just come out, and use at your own caution, but we think it's really great, and here's how we would use it, here's why we would use it. And that's actually, I think that's happened to us. I can think of multiple instances where that's occurred, and I can think of one for myself as well, where I've said, hey, this looks like a really cool tool. I haven't been able to use it yet, but we're here to talk about advanced methods, and so I want to bring it to your attention. And so I think our participants have been really open to that.
And I just wanted to add, the other principle that I think we adhere to is we're going to choose the tool that's free first. We are always going to choose the tool that doesn't require people to pay money to access. So it does add complications because we have to teach everyone how to use R if you haven't used R. But then the screening tools we use and that kind of thing, we always choose the free one. So I don't know if Anne or Brooks have anything else to add.
Or do you mind if I just kind of follow up on that question just really quickly, just in terms of something that we've seen is that sometimes like the computational power or using, some new API or tool actually does cost money. And the other one uses people, but people also cost money, right? In terms of like actually having students, like hiring students to hand code, and so it doesn't require paying for software, but it does require paying for their time. And so for us, we've actually also had to think about how we trade those two costs off in some ways. So I don't know how you think about, how you then those
Josh?
We haven't, I think maybe I'm probably, Brooks might be the better one here, the cost expert, but I would say we approach it with, whenever we're budgeting, we try to consider both. And I think you're right. You're highlighting that the upfront cost of the tool might seem pricey, but the longer term costs of including staff, even staff that are maybe early on and slightly more cost effective, they add up over time. So we have an entire session that is devoted to thinking about budget and what are the upper ends of costs or the lower ends of costs. Yeah, it's a tough one.
I'll jump in with a couple thoughts. So the tools that our training program is working with are as you can imagine, with helping districts or schools use evidence-based interventions. There are an enormous amount of clearinghouses that are currently available. So we've spent an awful lot of time kind of looking at different search mechanisms for, say, the What Works Clearinghouse and evidence for ESSA. Almost every state has their own or is developing their own clearinghouse. And they all have different search criteria, different filters that they use. So our schools, or the teams that we're working with, it's really, we're trying to help them learn how to do a search and what does evidence mean based on what's included in those clearinghouses. So we're not really promoting, say, one intervention over another or one clearinghouse over another. I think it's important that people are familiar with the array or corpus of outlets and clearinghouses, which can help them, determine an intervention or practice that might work really well for them. And you had asked about measures as well. So a lot of toolkits are available for evidence-based interventions. The teams that we've been coaching with often have data systems in place at their schools. So it's not so much that we're encouraging people to replace a measurement or evaluation system that they might already be working with, but really take advantage of what's available strategies or approaches that have been used by others in different situations. So it's really doing that, strengthening that complementary piece, taking more advantage of what's already there. In terms of cost, I just add one more thing, that almost all of our teams are interested in interventions that are free or low cost and that have small training requirements. So there's not a lot of in-house training that would be necessary to implement. I hope that addresses your question from my perspective, at least.
I mean, I feel like I have like the least applicable to this question because we just use like spreadsheets, and we that could be in Excel and it could be numbers, it could be Google Sheets, whatever, and then you can import that into whatever statistical software you're using if you like. But we definitely try in terms of like integrating with other methods. I think that has been I don't know, my soapbox for like the last 5, 7, I don't know how many years, bunch of years, and talking about like ways to integrate research on cost and cost effectiveness into other aspects of a field trial that are already ongoing. So I talk a lot about, and I'm saying I because I teach the session on integrating costs into an efficacy trial and thinking about how we might talk about implementation and costs and a theory of change within a context simultaneously, and the ways that our studies can be maybe more efficient by thinking about those things at the same time. So trying to do some of that and certainly open, and I think with each new cohort, we try to learn from our trainees about the different tools and different things that they're using in the field that maybe we could learn from and expand to others. I would maybe only add to that in terms of accessibility more broadly, we definitely as a team over time have thought about and evolved our thinking around making things freely available, and then not just available, but like how to get them into people's hands. So like that second step has been harder, whereas like, you know, I can put things up on our website and I can tweet about it and I can send out an email, but like getting people to actually remember and use it has been another sort of level of access.
Great. We had another question in the chat from Aaron Lyon, who asked, what kinds of evaluation do each of our programs conduct to determine whether and to what extent we're having our desired or anticipated impact? So I know Anne just started, but Anne just has one cohort, but anyone else want to jump in right now? Yeah. Me? Oh, Josh is pointing at me. Okay.
I was pointing at Brooks, but yeah.
Okay,
Oh,
no,
I thought you were
Brooks is
saying
fine.
something and I was like, you're muted. Like our sign language is clearly not up to par.
Totally.
Okay, sure. So we really try to do it through a process of following up with people to see, you know, how did the training work for them? Have they been able to implement the training in their own work? And some of this has been challenging, and I actually would love to sit down. We talked about Larry Hedges earlier with him to think this through more, because we're often training people to use methods that then they go and they submit an application to IES, and then that application takes a year to hear back from, and often the first time you apply you don't get accepted, so then it's a whole nother year then they apply, and then a whole nother year that they find it. So there's this like very long slow process, right, of shaping and shifting education research methods. But because we've been talking with people over a long period of time, we have been able to see our trainees come back and say, oh yes, this was really helpful with these kinds of reports or this kind of work. And then we've been able to share that information back with IES.
I think we do a similar thing, and I think we would echo your longing for a more immediate feedback. I think we get a little bit of that from surveys that we conduct, and we ask participants what they've learned and how they plan to use the information. We've followed up with our participants. We've been, like Terry, like you just said, we have a couple of cohorts that have been in the works for a few years now, so we're able to maybe see a little bit more of the impact in terms of grant proposals and grant awards and publications. And Terry, you might know off the top of your head, so you chime in after this, but you know, anecdotally, it seems like our impact is being felt. We're seeing folks, and we're hearing from folks who are submitting applications and winning awards and writing high quality publications. And I think every co-PI and PI and Terry have worked with our participants. That's maybe another outcome as well, is some of the direct involvement that we have on projects. After the workshops are over, I've worked with several more than several, probably close to 9 or 10 individuals after the fact on grant proposals or on their publications, or we get emails all the time. And if we believe in the work that we're doing, and we believe that what we're doing is correct, then we have to believe that those interactions are leading to higher quality proposals and publications. Terry, do you know how many? Do you remember?
No, I don't have it off the top of my head. But another anecdotal a piece of evidence is that one of the National Science Foundation program officers told me that they have seen an increase in the number and quality of the meta-analyses that are being submitted, and he directly blamed us. So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what we got that. And also, Josh didn't mention that, the connections that get made across the people in the cohort, and we've only had 2, they've also led to other papers. And I did see, I don't know if he's, oh yeah, I see Jason Chow here lurking. I know that he has published some meta-analyses with other people that were in the cohort as well. And I know that they've been like, that some of the connections with each other have been really fruitful as well. So, and Anne, I don't know if you want to talk about your plans. Yeah.
Sure. I think that that's a great question. And in terms of assessing capacity building or strengthening, the use of evidence-based interventions, it's a really challenging question. What we've done, we did do pre and post assessments on knowledge and intention through our workshops. But in our coaching, we kind of get a real-time assessment of how people have actually been using either tools and measures or methods, logic models, building logic models, issues like that from our workshop into their, their school plans or the interventions problems that they're trying to address. So we have a document that we call our next steps document, and at every coaching meeting, we outline, what each partner's, including ours, what each partner's tasks are for the, prior to the next meeting. And we've also been able to look at agendas for professional development that people have put together for the teachers at their school. We've looked at measures, data walk, procedures, implementation plans for restorative justice issues. There's really such a wide array of artifacts that we actually can look at in real time. So I think over the span of the year, we'll really have a strong collection of the approaches, interventions, adaptations, and the issues and concerns that our teams have been working with through the academic year. So I'm really excited about how those efforts have been going.
Great. Again, I just want to encourage anyone to put questions in the chat or unmute yourself. I have a couple of questions prepared, but I'd like to be responsive to people who are here as well. So one question, since I don't see anything right now in the chat, one question that, that's always been in my mind with these training grants is sort of the sustainability of the knowledge that people learn. Here, like we're sort of like an inoculation. Everyone, in some ways, at least our training grant is you come for, a week and then we just send you off. But I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about, how do we think about sustaining the knowledge and skills learned in the training grant?
Anne, I'm really excited about your model, and I'm excited to hear, a year from now, what you think about it and how it's going. For us, we've found that the follow-up coaching piece has really been hit or miss. It's some people just really, they finish the training, they go off and you don't hear from them again. Other people call frequently, and it's, we've thought a lot about like how to make sure that every person knows that they have access to us and that we can provide support even a year or 2 years out. And that's been just something that we've tried to be really conscious of, and we've tried to continue to sort of send emails and stay in touch with people and make sure we have their up-to-date emails and those kinds of things. But that's a piece that I'm trying to consider more and to think about, like, what kinds of support do you provide after they have a basic level of understanding, or when they're actually in a project. Yeah, I'll leave that there. But I think the actually hands-on support with an actual project is something that's helpful, but difficult to support when you've also got people in the same room who have, they're attending to apply for funding, right? So it's like balancing different needs in the same room.
I think it's always hard to kind of speculate about sustainability of knowledge and skills, but I would argue that many of the practices we're seeing are likely to be sustainable. And I'm thinking specifically of a couple of our teams, and they're already replicating and growing the knowledge and skill in their work with their teachers, colleagues, and in their districts, because it really is grounded in evidence of effectiveness. So it's at the forefront of what teachers and schools are really looking for. And we know from some of our teams that they're already getting positive feedback from how some of the, sorry about my dog, how some of the efforts that they've been making, that feedback's been really positive.
I'll just add one more thing. And it has to do with something that we've done, and that is creating materials that will last past potentially this grant life cycle. Sometimes I think, Terry, you're fond of making a joke about the videos that we've created in the last 10 years and how certain people's hairstyles have changed over the years and how much younger we look. And it's true that those things change. And it's true that sometimes methods will shift, or something comes in vogue and something goes out of style. And but I think in large part, the methods that Maddie is teaching will continue to live on, maybe not for many decades, but at least for the foreseeable future. And so creating and turning our presentations and to a certain extent, our hands-on activities into videos or different tools that can last and live in that Google search will have probably an impact not only on our participants, but on the field at large.
And Anne-Marie, you have something you want to ask?
Yeah. So myself and Dr. Guadalupe Carmona are working on a Pathways training grant, and there she is. And I'm just interested in the conversation that's happening here about training of researchers, and we're working with undergraduates, and other Pathways grants are working with graduate students. And there's so many interesting intersections between our work, and we're like waiting for these meetings for us to have conversations about this. And it just seems like we should be having deeper conversations across these grants prior to just an hour-long panel, or an hour and a half, whatever we're in here for, because we're working not only with students, but also mentors who are active researchers. And in terms of Aaron's question there, the sustainability piece for us is that the mentors are working with undergraduates, and then we're hoping that the mentorship continues beyond the life of the IES grants, right? But we're also hoping that that the training that we're doing with our young folks is that they will go into the field of educational research. And then, of course, maybe they'll connect with a training grant later, from IES at some point. But my actual question is, are we doing enough to really leverage the kind of the knowledge base across these training grants, across the different programs? And Pathways is a newer program, but I love seeing there's like 3 pages of people here at this session, and we had a very tiny little session, and that's I don't have session envy. I'm just being very clear that we need more people invested in the undergraduate, graduate, and researcher. I'm loath to use the pipeline metaphor, but we really need this whole continuum of where researchers start their trajectory and where they are going in their careers. And so I'm wondering from you all, your perspective of how do you think these training grants could do a better job of connecting perhaps across that continuum?
I can give a quick answer as a person who also co-directs a pre-doc program here. This virtual meeting that we're having, it's just such a loss, right? Normally we would be in person and we would be in the same room as training programs. And so it would be the methods training people with the pre-doc training people, with the postdoc training people, with the pipeline people. And we would all be in the same room and we would have a chance to really hear and learn from one another, and then also build some of these relationships so that our trainees could potentially meet one another, right? And potentially like do trainings and other things that we supplement our regular activities with together. And so to me, like, I'm really glad that you spoke up. I think, maybe we can reach out with Alan Ruby's here and others from IES, and maybe they could help us even have like some other kind of like training grant specific get together where we could like better get to know one another.
Well, I have been approached by NSF to think about a conference for at least the training grants that have been funded by NSF, although they have suggested that we include the IES ones. So I've been sort of a little bit slow in my thinking through what this would look like, but I may call on some of you who are interested in this idea to help me think through what a conference like that would think about, because NSF has been open. But I've been sort of, it's been hard for me to conceptualize it, but now that I have other people interested who I know how to get a hold of, then I will be on that. Go on, Ann. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question. And as you've heard, our audience includes practitioners, education professionals, as well as faculty from higher education. And so I want to speak to that point just for a minute. We, I think the use of evidence-based interventions in schools and the connection with higher education requires faculty to actually think about their research in a different way, rather than developing an intervention. It's on working with districts or schools where they are in terms of implementing or understanding evaluation techniques and how to use data to inform whether or not an intervention or practice is working. And I think that those kinds of skills are not at the forefront of many faculty in higher education. It's a very different training model that many of us learned through, where, you know, we're contributing to the march of science in terms of, here's our theory, here's our intervention, here's our plan to test it, here's our cost effectiveness, you know, approach to looking at, you know, how well and how meaningful the applicable the results might be. So that's like one area that I know for our program that we really are working on strengthening for cohort 2 is really making this work more appealing to a higher education audience. Are the faculty that we have been working with, I think, you know, we know from what they've shared is that they have been including some of our materials in their classes. So using, you know, the materials and outlets that are already existing to help newer graduate students, you know, either master's or doctoral level, or to some degree undergraduate, really see the value of working with schools where they are, instead of seeing them as a research site or just a way to collect data. So that's my thought on that.
I just want to quickly say I'm a teacher educator, and so I'm completely on board with you here.
Let's see, there was a little bit of stuff going on in the chat. So there's a conversation between, let's see, Jason and James here about IES and how these training grants are informing IES and IES reviews. So I don't know, Jason, if you want to ask your question, and maybe James, if you want to jump in here.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Jason is unable to unmute himself.
Oh, okay. So I'll read, Jason, I'll read your question. Was Jason asked if there's any direct conversations with IES in terms of aligning panel review with the training programs they are funding. For example, do reviewers get some guidelines based on what IES is funding folks to learn and use in their proposals? And so, James, you volunteered to give us some insight here.
Yeah, okay. And I would preface that by saying to everybody that's participating that, you know, that our methods training grants are really doing a lot without being our most expensive grants. In fact, these methods training grants cost about 1/3 of an efficacy study. So I think it's, you know, I appreciate all the questions about how we track the, you know, the outcomes of these grants and how many people the methods training grantees are touching with their work. And I think it's worthy of having a conversation about that. But we also need to keep in mind that these grantees are funded primarily to offer training rather than to rigorously assess the outcomes of their grants. But to get to the point, to answer the question about the review panels, what I would say is the Standards and Review Office does include methodologists on the review panels, and they will try to include a methodologist that has expertise in the specific method that an applicant is proposing. So I think that they do a good job of that, and oftentimes there are really some, you know, leading experts in the field that serve as methodologists on the panels. what they're also trying to do, though, is to make sure that the methodological perspective is balanced with other perspectives, like how is this going to play out for students? What, how might the research lead to meaningful changes in programming at schools, and how might it impact different groups of students differently? So yes, so I would leave it at that.
Sorry, everyone. I'm back. I was multitasking, but I did. No, thanks, James. That was really great. And so my question was just more of, and that definitely answered most of it. But in terms of, from the outside perspective, IES is funding these trainings, which I think inherently we as investigators would assume these are the methods we should use in our proposals. And then just wondering if there's any sort of, so we get trained, and I've been to several and they've been great. And then we propose grants using these methods, and then they go to a body of reviewers who then review what we think is what IES wants, I guess. And then so thinking about if reviewers have any guidance or at least knowledge of what is being taught in these trainings as sort of like maybe like a one-pager. It's like, here's what they learned, here's what they encountered in the trainings, or is it pretty much completely a separate entity? And sort of I don't know if I'm making any sense here, but in sort of the contextual loop of expectation versus evaluation of us as trying to get some work done, right?
Right, and trying to get funding. And I hear you, Jason. It's a valid question, but we live in this wonderful democracy in which there's all kinds of separation between different units within IES and the Department of Education. And when we send applications to a review panel, we're basically really trusting those independent reviewers to apply their best professional judgment of what represents a scientifically valid and important study and what doesn't.
Yeah, and that's great. Thanks. I was just curious if there was if there was anything behind the scenes that I wasn't aware of, but that's really helpful. Thanks.
So we have a couple more minutes. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anyone have any questions? Any other questions I want to ask? I could ask one more that kind of follows along with what we were just talking about. So maybe just for the last sort of question, kind of along with the same theme that we were talking about with Anne-Marie, what lessons or issues do you think we need to take back sort of to graduate, or as Anne-Marie has pointed out, undergraduate training from our grants? Any other lessons we might want to think about?
I think I'll jump in and say that I'm kind of building on what we talked about earlier, is that the notion of partnerships and how to get our graduate students prepared to actually work effectively in partnership with not just research agencies, but also with state education agencies and schools. I think that's really critical. And there are a lot of opportunities for methodology graduate students to work with districts and schools, especially around the use of data. So I think that's kind of a gap. We tend to train our graduate students to, seek positions where they have a lot of data to work with. They might be collecting using large scale surveys and issues like that, but schools are really struggling with even smaller amounts of data, either by grade or by focusing on kindergarten. So it's difficult to link some of the data that they're collecting with, say, assessment data. And I think that's a really important link that should happen so that we can get a better understanding for well-being and how that relates to academic outcomes. So I would say that thinking of data more minutely rather than always training, with large scale data and fancy statistical models. There's room for training our graduate students in working with actual real and messy data. If I could, can I add one more thing? We had a question that was in the chat about diversity, and I just want to make a comment that we really are working hard to reach out to disadvantaged school districts, as well as high minority higher education institutes. I'd say we've been a little bit successful, and I know we can do better, but that's a real important component for the people we're trying to engage in our training. So I think that those issues also, are rising to the top of how graduate education is changing now, but I think there's always room for improvement along those lines.
Well, thank you. We are at time, and I want to be respectful for everyone. I don't know if Brooks or Josh, if you have any parting shots. Okay. Okay. Anyway, thank you all for attending. Really appreciate the engagement. Please feel free to contact any of us about our training grants or any other follow-up questions, and have a good rest of the day.